thought that the same applies, what applies in your essays and dissertations, correct attribute. A couple of PowerPoints, and this is going to be recorded. So, and the slides will be available as well, of course. And I've got a couple of resources that I'm recommending for this. So it's going to be fairly fast and intense. So I hope you've had enough caffeine or whatever keeps you going to hold on to this. We're going to do this in two parts, and I know you know a lot of this stuff, but I feel the need to remind everybody to put what we're talking about in context. So we're going to start talking about copyright to start off with, and then we're going to start talking about copyright and intellectual property as it applies in publishing, and so I hope that that's okay. I'm not going to go into copyright in a massive amount of detail, but just to remind you of what some of these the kind of key areas that we really need to be aware of, because once we're involved in publishing, we are taking part in a legal activity of publicizing work, of making it public. We have to be really careful about copyright, but we also have to be careful about the other laws, about incitement to hatred, for example, you know, and all of the rest of the things, because we're promulgating information. And so we have to be careful about what we do here. There are certain key areas that we need to be aware of. And we're going to look at this copyright and intellectual property rights 101. Obviously, I put in a disclaimer there that if you are in legal copyright issue, please see a lawyer, and that this isn't a substitute for that. I'm going to put myself in a timer as well, just to make sure there's enough time left for questions. So just to remind you, a lot of you will know about this back in the 1710 Queen Anne's legislation was widely sort of considered to be the first enactment of copyright law in the world, but actually Ireland lays a claim to it earlier, back in the 6th century, when Saint Columcille borrowed a copy of the Vulgate Bible from Saint Finian of Moville and made a copy of it. As he did, he had a kind of a, sort of a scriptorium going on where he was copying everything. It was like a 6th century equivalent of the Google Books project. He was trying to make everything available. And when Finian found out about this, he was very angry, took the case to Diarmid, the High King in Tara. Diarmid ruled in favour of Finian, famously saying, "To every cow her calf, and to every book its copy." So saying that the copies of the book belong with the original owner of the book itself. Columcille was very unhappy about that. It led to a huge battle, and at least 3,000 men died as a result of this. So we took our copyright pretty seriously here. So, and it's still taken very seriously. So the Irish Copyright Licensing Agency that I'll mention later on still uses that little cow emblem in its logo with the copyright symbol in it as well. So we know about this, so we're going to go through it quite quickly. Copyright is a property right. It's there to protect the economic interests of the people or the organizations who create various kinds of works, but not all kinds of works. Those people own the rights in their work, and their work can't be taken from them or used without their permission. Copyright covers moral rights as well, and those are the right to be identified as the creator of the work, not to have the works falsely attributed to them, or to have your work falsely attributed to somebody else. And it covers the right not to have your work changed or adapted in any way without your permission. Okay, so that's basic and inherent. The legislation in Ireland is basically the Copyright and Related Rights Act 2000 plus the other acts. But I should mention, Trinity has an IP policy that has something to say about this as well. So that's something that should be checked as well, is TCT's IP policy. And I'll add that into the link into our slides as well, because the Copyright and Related Rights Act 2000 in Ireland says that copyright belongs to the author. Very like in the 6th century, it belongs to the owner of the copyright. But it says in certain circumstances, for example, in the case of employment, the copyright belongs to the institution. For example, Trinity College Dublin, depending on the terms of your grant, for example, or if you're in any kind of employment or using Trinity's equipment and supplies. So that means pretty much everybody. It belongs to Trinity. But Trinity says that they waive the right in the IP policy, and they actually hand it over to the author. It's a grey area. And if it was really challenged in law, how would it stand up? We don't know, because it's never happened. Not just Trinity, but all universities do this in order to allow authors to publish freely and keep the whole scholarly communication thing going. So what's protected? Scholarly works. literary works. And literary works, interestingly, include software code, dramatic works, musical works, artistic works, and audiovisual materials, sound recordings, etc. So all kinds of things that you could possibly include in your journal articles. What's not protected is ideas, concepts, styles, techniques, or this kind of information, or works that are too small or unoriginal to be protected, like single words and names and so on. But they can be protected by trademarks, which is a different kind of intellectual property rights. So a lot of authors think that the work is their own because, you know, that's inherent. That may not be the case. As I mentioned, it could be your institution. It could be a third party, such as a journal publisher, if you agree as an author to transfer your ownership of copyright to the publisher, or if as a publisher you insist on the transfer of copyright. And there's different ways of doing that. This practice of signing over copyright exclusive rights to your publisher has been the norm until very recently, but now a lot of authors are opting to retain their copyright under alternative models. So we'll have a look at copyright retention later on. So copyright retention is automatic. There's no system of registration for copyright protection in Ireland, although there is in the UK. There's the UK Copyright Service. So in Ireland, protection is free and automatic from the time it's written down or recorded or created in the first place and finished. So it provided that it's resulted from the creator's own effort and it's not copied from any other work. So originality is really important in terms of copyright and the completion of the work, that publishing or recording to making it available. In Ireland, an author can prove that they've created the work if you need to do that, if there's an action, legal action taken for infringement. In order to do that, you can adopt a very John le Carré kind of approach, which would be sending a copy of the work to him or herself by registered post and keeping the post office receipt and leaving the envelope unopened. It sounds very much Spy Who Came In from the Cold, but it works. Or you could register the work with an organisation such as the UK Copyright Service, but that does charge a fee for registration. So copyright notice doesn't have to be placed on a work before it's protected by copyright. Copyright is inherent, but it is prudent to do so because it reminds people that the work is protected and it identifies the person claiming the rights. The notice is usually that C within a circle, followed by the name of the author or the copyright holder. Sometimes you'll see confusing statements appearing on journals. For example, it might say copyright, the publisher, and then say it's licensed under a Creative Commons license. It's really important to make sure that what appears with the copyright symbol, if you're including it, is actually in tune with the rest of your policies with the licenses. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Copyright lasts in most cases for the creator's lifetime plus 70 years. You as a publisher will have 25 years of copyright in the typography and the formatting of the words on the page. So even an edition of an author who might be deceased can't be copied if the publisher has the typographic copyright in it. Sound recordings 50 years after they're published, and photographs and official publications and unpublished works have different rules. And it's really important to note, especially when you're publishers, you're publishing journal articles, there can be several rights valid simultaneously in the same article. You have the author's right, you have your own typographic right, you have the rights of any authors who may have created images or photographs or third-party copyright of other kinds. So there can be simultaneous rights in operation at the same time. When the content is that may be out of copyright, a publisher, as I've mentioned, can continue to have the copyright in the typographic arrangement. And rights equivalent to author's rights can be acquired for 25 years by anybody who makes the work available to the public after the original copyright has expired. So you could discover some wonderful work, perhaps in the library in Trinity, and decide to publish it. And if it hasn't been published previously and if the public domain has expired, you can get copyright for 25 years after that. And of course, database right applies to anyone who makes a substantial investment in creating a database, and it applies 15 years from the end of the year when the database was completed, which might be never, you know, because databases can actually keep on going on forever. So Now, this is important. The legal rights of the copyright owners. There are economic rights, obviously, in order to help the copyright owners to claim royalties and prevent others from exploiting the works in different ways. And there's restrictions on copying the work, making it available to the public, distributing it, which is what publishers do, renting or lending it, and translating, arranging, or adapting the work. So all of those are economic rights of copyright holders. I've mentioned the moral rights before that was introduced in Ireland as a result of the European directives that were aimed at harmonising European law. So the moral rights are the paternity right, the right to be identified as the author of the work, the integrity right to prevent mutilation, distortion, or derogatory alteration of the work, and the right of false attribution, the right not to have a work falsely attributed to you. Authors can waive their moral rights, but they have to do it in writing. It has to be formalized. And this is the one that I'm going to come back to again in the next section, exceptions to copyright. The author can't prevent copying or use of his or her work if it's covered by these exceptions. Now, I know you know a lot of these because you've been studying here, you've been using this work. So those are insubstantial copying, fair dealing, educational uses, and libraries and archives. And insubstantial copying is a small proportion. A substantial part of the work must be copied in order to infringe the copyright. So what we're talking about here is, let's say, for example, you're publishing an article and there's a lengthy chunk taken from some other work that somebody else owns. You have to be careful about that because you could infringe copyright by going over the amount. And insubstantial copying is therefore permitted. And I know what you're going to say is, what constitutes insubstantial or substantial copying? And the answer is, we don't know. There is no definition of it, which really makes it very murky. We're usually looking at a very small percentage of a work. In the library, they would say, we're usually talking about just a couple of lines. But if we're talking about a paragraph or more, then we need to be careful about that. Fair dealing is the one that we use in universities all the time. It's for the work can be used for the purposes of research or private study without the prior permission of the author, provided the use is conducted in a way that does not prejudice the rights of the copyright owner. So that's what we use when we're writing essays in college or dissertations, and we're putting in submitted works, and we're permitted to use chunks of works and to quote from them. That is different to publishing. And Jane and I came across some situations where student publishers in particular thought that the same applies, what applies in your essays and dissertations, correct attribution, for example, and all of that was sufficient. It is not sufficient. It has to be in a situation that is insubstantial and doesn't prejudice the rights of the copyright owner. So there has to be an acknowledgement, which we know as attribution. So we'll come back to that again. Educational uses is very limited, quoting from a work in examinations or the inclusion of a short passage in an anthology for schools, for example. And then finally, libraries are allowed to allow copying of works, hence the photocopiers and all the notices around them in the library, which nobody reads, obviously, it says what you can do with that information. And public libraries are allowed to lend works. So you see, copyright is very, very precise about what can and cannot be done with the work. And here we come to assigning rights. So copyright owners own they have implicit ownership of the work, but they can actually assign or license their rights. Assigning the rights means somebody else becomes the owner, and licensing it means somebody else can use the copyright material, but they don't own it. They can use it for a period of time. The assignment has to be in writing, signed on or behalf of the owner of the copyright in order to be legally effective. And where the copyright is assigned, the person to whom the copyright is transferred has to be, it becomes a new copyright owner. This idea of an exclusive license was traditionally applied to published works. So many of you will have encountered this. A lot of authors are so delighted to get published, to be accepted for publishing, they don't even read it. They just kind of hand over exclusive rights. It's like handing over the key to your car or to your house to somebody else. You can't jump in and use it again. It belongs to someone else. And your rights are extremely limited about what you can do. So our academics who hand over their rights exclusively to publishers, to big publishers, have very limited rights on what they can, whether they can even put that work legally on their own website. They're not allowed to do that. They're really limited in what they can do with the works in their lectures and so on. So exclusive licenses are very restrictive for many reasons. They work well for publishers because publishers don't have to go back and keep asking the author if they want to move the work on or reprint it or something like that. They don't have to do it because they own it, and they own all versions of it too. So a non-exclusive license then is a license to do something with your work, and you can grant people non-exclusive licenses to use your work in a particular way. And the increasingly popular Creative Commons licenses are a great example of this. We'll be looking at them in a few minutes. So it's really important to note that copyright, while it might look really restrictive, copyright is about protection. It's about protection of property rights for the people who own them. And those owners are the author or the person who the author allows to use the work. So for authors and others, for publishers, you can make your work freely available on the web, and you can still retain your copyright protection so long as you retain the ownership of your work. And the ownership is really important. Okay. So that is our first part. Is there anybody got any questions on this bit, on that part of the copyright licensing and the rights and the ownership?
Just with the fair dealing bit. So if we are publishing essays, are they able to quote within the essays? Sorry, what I'm trying to say is, because obviously you're saying that thesis work is different. You're able to have long paragraphs of certain authors, etc. If we're publishing essays, do those rules not apply to us? Would we have to kind of tweak the essays a bit to use less quotes per se?
You may need to do that. We're going to take a look at that when we're going to jump into copyright clearance in the next session, because we're going to take that copyright law, that the law of the land and the law of Europe, and apply it in the three main ways in the publishing environment. So maybe, Sarika, when we come back into, we'll have a look at that specifically when we're in that section. Okay.
Right, thank you.
Great. So yeah, really good question. Any other questions about the law and that section, or are we okay to move on to the next bit? So as I say, I know that quite a lot of you will have come across quite a lot of this before, but I think that we do have to go through it in any session like this. So I'll just go back into sharing the screen and go into my okay. Copyright for publishers. So, okay. Again, this is for training purposes. So let's go into it here. There's a resource that I really recommend that you look at and familiarize yourself. This is the Bible when it comes to this whole area, and it's WIPO. It's the World Intellectual Property Organization, representing truly the world. All, Global South, Global North, everybody's represented on WIPO. And it meets sort of on a very regular basis. It's produced managing intellectual property in the book publishing industry. It's a business-oriented information booklet, it says, but it's actually absolutely brilliant in this whole area. It deals with this section C, publishers' responsibilities in negotiating agreements with authors and so on. So this is the granting of licenses, rights, the commissioned works, and delivery and publication dates, all kinds of things to do with warranties and indemnities. If you're paying the authors, which I think is unlikely unless you start to get very wealthy philanthropist coming in to look after you, then probably not. Termination and concluding an agreement. And then very importantly, as you said, Sarika, managing secondary and third party rights, operating a secure permission system, text excerpts, illustrations and web content, artwork of various kinds, the picture acknowledgements, web content, and all of this, including subsidiary rights. The Bible, as I said, and there's a link up there to how to using that. And the second one that I recommend is the University of Toronto Libraries has this brilliant series of web pages on journal publishing guide, copyright and licensing. And it's the lovely thing about it is it's directly linked in with Open Journal System because they're using that. So when they talk about where to display the copyright license and so on, they're linking it into OJS to make it what you have to do and how you go about doing it. So there's a link to that as well. So we're going to go through some of this now. So we've got three things to think about. The first thing is to inform yourself, which is what you're doing today. So well done. Second thing is you decide your policies. And some of you may already have some policies, but take another look at them and just check through them. And the third thing is to make your policies really clear in Open Journal system for the author submissions, and to make sure that the journal web pages have that information really clearly displayed on it. So what policies are we talking about, right? We're talking about the copyright clearance processes and author guidance. We're talking about copyright ownership, so that the reality and the practical interpretation of the law for publishing, the type of licenses that you can use, and something that is required in the open access environment is a self-archiving policy. And these things, some of these things might seem more or less familiar to you, but they'll all be familiar in a few minutes. First of all, third-party copyright clearance. You remember the exceptions in substantial copying, fair dealing, the educational uses, and libraries and archives. So let's have a look here. So here's the basic rules for this. Check copyright protected materials in any work. Pay special attention to this list of the following, and all of these may require copyright clearance. Long quotations. Now, more than 10% of a work is really, that is very generous. So you might need to be more careful than that. So more than 10% of any given work, if it's a book, for example, that could be a lot of information. Reproduced publications of any kind. So something that's been published before, something that hasn't been published before, but where the author copyright applies. Poetry, for example, so you need to be careful if you're including an entire poem, that's a whole work, you know, so we need to be careful about that. Dialogue from a play or a screen or a novel. Music and sheet music, we know all about music and copyright infringement because there's been all these causes célèbres about, you know, and music agents are really, really careful about music, even a few bars of it being recreated somewhere else, or lyrics, you know, from a song. So typically you'll see copyright permission being sought for the use of this material. Very much graphic or pictorial work. So that's incredibly important. Anything that we've got, computer software, as I mentioned, and sources located on the internet are also subject to copyright. We had an example in one student journal, Shane, I hope it's okay if I mention it, where I think there were about 8 full page copies of from a graphic novel were included. There was more than 8 actually from a particular graphic novel. No copyright was sought for that, and we actually couldn't publish that. We weren't able to make it available. What happens then is that, so it's really important to include the necessity to clear copyright prior to submission in the author instructions. So you'll see all publishers, scholarly publishers, will include in the instructions, and you know where they are in OJS, to authors. We will not publish anything that hasn't got copyright cleared. So the publisher is trying to put the onus for copyright clearance on the author. However, you're still the publisher. So the onus is still, you're still going to have to check this and keep an eye on it, to go through it and spot those images and do a check. You usually want your authors to give you a list of the copyright clearance that's there. So the next thing, when you're including third-party content, second or third party content, try and check and see if the content qualifies as substantial reproductions, and you have to use some common sense there, or if it's in the public domain, which is great, or if it's covered by license agreements. So you might see Creative Commons attribution, you're free to use this so long as you attribute it. Perfect, you're absolutely laughing if that's happening. If it falls within the fair dealing guidelines, you know, those are a bit iffy, but you might be able to use them. Or if it requires copyright permission or copyright clearance, that can be obtained in a timely manner. If the answer is no to at least one of those, you will not be compliant with copyright legislation if you publish the work with the inclusion of the content. You might have to reject the content, and that's what a lot of publishers do. So clearing copyright, the good news is that there's a whole lot of help there, and especially if you're publishing in scientific areas. The STM, the Science Technical Medical Publishers Guidelines, have come to a deal. And so, for example, with Oxford University Press, you can look up their link and you can see they will allow up to quite a lot of content to be included from work that they publish without you having to go through copyright clearance. So that's brilliant if you're in one of these areas. So do go in and take a look at what they cover. If not, you can go in and find out about who's the copyright holder by using the COPAC Union Library Catalogue. And sorry, I left out this. This was the copyright artists and copyright holders. That's in Tyler University. I'll have to put in the link to that. There's the Designers and Artists Copyright Society. The UK has a copyright clearance centre as well. They have everything. They've monetized it all, so you can pay. And if you're desperate to include something and put it through the copyright licensing agency, that crowd with a little cow in their logo. Or else, if you can't get any joy there, and we're talking about, in the first instance, to be au fait with these mechanisms. Write to the author with a clear description of what's required. Publishers will usually ask authors to do this, and they need to include the word count, where it will be published and why it's required. And a lot of publishers provide their authors with standard forms or letters. The big ones, like Oxford University Press, have a whole lot of information that I've included down here that's actually really useful in this area. So they will provide authors with standard forms, but there's one thing for sure: if it can't be cleared, it can't be used. If it's not free, you can't do that. So clearing copyright also can take much longer than anticipated. So the author should start clearing copyright as soon as they've identified the content that's going to go into the work, right? So anybody writing an article, so this is why instructions for authors are really important, and you're doing this to protect themselves and to protect yourself as the publisher as well. So so it is a process that there's a way through it. There's a process. All publishers deal with this, and you get used to it. But it's something that starts at quite an early stage, and you try and get the authors to do as much as you possibly can and not submit papers that don't have copyright cleared. Okay, so that saves you all that, well, quite a lot of that time, but you still. I'm going to go into copyright ownership now and do a recap on the author warranty and transfer of copyright. So as I mentioned, it's currently the norm in traditional academic publishing for authors to transfer exclusive rights to the publisher, but we're going to look at the alternatives that are becoming increasingly popular. First, here's an example of a copyright transfer agreement from Wiley, and I could show you tons of other ones. There's a full 6-page copyright transfer agreement, and you can go in and have a look at it at the link if you really want to delve into it. It's incredibly restrictive from the point of view of the author. The contributor, that's the author, assigns to the owner during the full term of copyright any extensions or renewals, all the copyright in and to the contribution, all rights therein, including and not limited to the rights to publish, republish, transmit, sell, distribute, but also develop derivative works in the world in any language or any media. So if they want to make a documentary out of their work, no, they've handed over the license to the publisher, no can do. So those rights are gone. And that is what has been the norm up until now. An extraordinary situation of transfer of public ownership to private funds, where typically publishers will then go on to sell that material right back to the institutions who own it in the first place. But I won't go into that at the moment. The alternative is that several top universities in the world, like Harvard, require their authors to retain copyright to their work, and they don't agree to an exclusive transfer. So Harvard have an agreement addendum generator to give to publishers. As publishers, you're going to be seeing some more of this sort of thing going on. And I'm going to mention Plan S. Has anybody here not heard of Plan S? Okay, good. We'll have a quick mention of Plan S in a minute. So that requires that authors do not transfer the copyright to their manuscripts. And Ireland's National Framework for the Transition to an Open Research Environment recommends copyright retention and is going to start working towards changing legislation, hopefully, in order to recognise that. In many countries, even when authors transfer copyrights to publishers, there's legislation enacted to enable secondary rights. So Germany was the first, followed by France, the Netherlands. Even if an author hands over their rights to a publisher, the rights revert after 6 months to the public domain. Right? So this is ways that countries are trying to do to get around this kind of a practice. So this is Lawrence Lessig, who some of you may have heard of. I'll see if I can give him a little bit of chat. He is the pioneer of Creative Commons licenses, professor of law in Harvard, and the director of the Creative Commons Institute in the beginning. Let's see if we can hear a bit from Lawrence, and hopefully I don't have to play any ads. Oh.
Well, I think the clear benefit is that it sets up simple, clear understandings about who is entitled to what with respect to the work that's created. And, you know, there can be different policies. You could have a policy that says basically everything that's created is free for anybody to use, or you could say everything that's created is free for non-commercial use for everybody to use. But regardless of what the policy is, if you have a clear statement, it makes it easy to understand what should be happening to this material. But I think the second part of it, which is often missed, but I think is a very important part of this discussion, is you don't want school districts to turn a blind eye to the question of who owns what. So when you have kids and you tell them, go out and do some report about World War II and gather as many images as you can about World War II and put it together in a video where you narrate, if you just say, go to the web and do this, these kids are going to be taking lots of material which is presumptively under copyright and for which there is no permission to use that material. And instead, if schools have a clear Creative Commons policy, you could begin to educate the students about the need to go use material which is authorized for this kind of use. And there's an enormous amount of it. Now, I do think companies like Google and Microsoft need to do a better job in making it easy for people to obey the law. So you go to the Google image search page and you type in, you know, fighter jet, and up comes, you know, 10,000 images of fighter jets. And to the left, you've got all these different ways to filter the images, including, you know, filter it on the basis of the hue of the image, you know, to a yellow images of fighter jets or something like that. But it's astonishing that there is no way to filter on the basis of reuse. Like, which of these images am I already licensed to reuse, right? If you
So great idea from Professor Lawrence Lessig. So let me just go out of this. Sorry. Move on here. Sorry, a moment. Okay, so Creative Commons, as Professor Lessig, as we mentioned with Professor Lessig, is a way for authors to retain, or the owners to retain, the copyright in an item or piece of work without handing over the copyright, but allows other people to use it. So they provide Creative Commons licenses and public domain tools, and it's a non-profit organization to make this to free up intellectual property and allow it to be used without infringing or jeopardizing the author's property rights in that. These are the types of Creative Commons licenses, and some of you will be familiar with these because you'll have seen them and maybe you've operated them in Open Journal system. You'll see them all over the place now. They're growing and growing, and I thought it was a great idea of Professor Lessig to suggest that this should be taught in schools. You know, kids need to know about what can be used and what can be freely used. These licenses go in order of increasing restriction from the public domain, CC0, to CC BY, which is attribution only. That's just attribution is required, but people are free to reuse it after that. You can see you can redistribute, copy, publish, display, etc. The orange, you have to attribute the work, a work. The commercial use ones will allow you to use it commercially or not. If you put an NC, non-commercial, you're not allowed to use it. The end user is not allowed to use it commercially. The ND part of the derivatives, you can modify it or adapt it or not. So you can choose the different kinds of licenses. So this, as I say, the most open license is at the very top. CC BY is the attribution one only, and that's the one that we usually see funders, research funders requiring. What we've been using in Tara, in Trinity's Access to Research Archive, is the CC BY attribution, NC, non-commercial, share alike. Share alike meaning that you're free to redistribute, copy, publish, display, communicate this work with attribution, so long as the work that you create, the new work, is published under the same license, right? So that's share alike. So you don't want it to be published under a different license. So if you publish a work, let's say it's an artwork or it's an original essay or something like that, and you decide that you're going to provide this Creative Commons attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license, right? You can use the work, you can copy it and publish it and display it, but you can't change it. And you can put an essay on that. You can put in that you want it to be reproduced under the same license. So you've got a choice of licenses, and it's horses for courses. Nobody's going to tell you within Trinity that you should do one over another, but research funders will definitely tell their authors that they should be publishing under specific licenses. So we'll have a look at what that means. So there's Tara there. There's a Creative Commons license picker or chooser, I think they call it. So you can go in, answer a couple of questions online. There's the link, and it asks you just 2 questions. Will you allow adaptations of your work to be shared? Yes or no? Or yes, as long as other people share it and under the same license. And will you allow commercial uses of your work? Yes or no? And depending, I said yes, as long as others share alike. And I said yes to commercial uses. And it gave me an attribution share alike license with a link that I can use in my work. Okay. Now, Open Journal Systems makes life easy for us because it allows us to apply a specific license to all of the works in our journal, or we can also apply different licenses within Open Journal System, depending on the work itself. So this is part of your policies that you're going to decide on. What's going to be your basic license? Just to give you an idea, Wikipedia uses a CC BY license. So that is a Wikimedia Commons, where I get all my images from. So because they're free to use. The attribution, CC BY is attribution. So they allow, it's a very open license. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology's famous open courseware that they started making available since 2004, all of their courseware, they make that available very generously, but they apply a CC BY NC, remember what that is, no, non-commercial, share alike, it has to be distributed under the set terms of the same license. So the work has to be accredited. I'm going to ask you to check something for me. PLOS One, some of you will be familiar with that, the Public Library of Science 1. Could you go in there and have a quick look and see, can you tell what license that PLOS One applies to its works? So you usually go in and have a look at an article, for example, in PLOS One, and have a look and see what information is there. Who's going to be the first to tell me? And Shane, you're not allowed.
They use a CC BY license.
Excellent. Well done. Who got that? Who said it? Was it Erica?
Yeah, I just found
well
it on their terms of use page, Creative Commons attribution.
Brilliant. That's great. So you will find it on the terms of use. Absolutely. And that's where authors and people who want to use work will go and have a look. They'll look for the licensing there. So you'll see that there. So that is a great example of that. So what I did was with that one, actually, if you go into one of the articles, you'll see it on the article itself. You'll see the Creative Commons CC BY is actually reproduced on that too. Public Library of Science is an open access journal, is now the biggest journal in the world. It's revolutionary, it's a game changer. So that's about our licenses. We're going to leave that there. We'll have a few questions about that, I'm sure, afterwards. One thing that you might not be very familiar with is the self-archiving policy. And I'm going to mention that. So that's another policy that you need to think about in your journal. And it's a pretty straightforward one. If you've already decided that you've got an open access journal and you've decided, for example, that the authors retain copyright, it's a natural follow-on that you will allow those authors to archive their works in an open access repository, okay? but you might put some restrictions on it. It's completely up to yourself. So the Sherpa Romeo database is a database of publishers' policies on author self-archiving. It's used by, let's say, the likes of me and Edie and Monica who work in Tara. When anybody uploads a publication in Trinity, they could be, you know, scientists or they're a historian or whatever they are, and they upload a publication to Tara for us to archive it in Tara and make it available. We check Sherpa Romeo to check the publisher's policies to make sure the publisher will allow us to do that, right? And this might seem as if it's kind of like a tangent, but it's not, because it's important for registration with the directory of open access journals. So if you want to get that, you know, quality mark, you will decide on what your self-archiving policy is. And here's an example. I looked up the Irish Journal of Medical Science, and I can look up who publishes it. So you put in all the information about your journal. It's a great way of getting your journal recognized as well. And you put in your policy, it asks you a bunch of questions. Will you allow the authors to self-archive? Do they retain copyright? Do you have any restrictions? Like, you can say, yes, but we want to make sure that there's a link to the published version of the work. Or we'll allow authors to archive their accepted manuscript, you know, after peer review, but not the final version of the work. So you've got some choices there. In order to have a look at the Suggest a New Journal form, and you can see the kind of questions that are asked there. And in OJS, then there's an actual box that you can put in under the settings, distribution and permission section, and complete the self-archiving policy box, right? So that's part of this world of open access, licensing, and self-archiving, what your authors are allowed to do, okay? Some of these things are actually required because we've got Plan S. So Plan S is the latest thing that we have. It's funders such as Science Foundation Ireland, the Wellcome Trust, the World Health Organization, Gates Foundation, all the UK Research Funding Councils, and the European Commission coming in here now, who are either members or supporters of Coalition S. They require immediate open access, and they require publication in a Plan S compliant journal. Wouldn't it be great if your journals aim to become Plan S compliant? You might not even like Plan S, because lots of people don't. They think it's too coercive. But why not comply with it if you possibly can? You don't have to tell anyone, but it would be a good thing for your journal. What they're looking for, so the journals have to be registered in the DOAJ. They have to be open access. And or deposit in a repository like Tara. They're also looking for something really new, that the author has to retain copyright of the author's accepted manuscript. So our poor authors in Trinity now have to go and include a copyright retention statement with every submission to their journal. You might even have people submitting to your journal, which will include this copyright retention statement. Now you know what it is. You might be perfectly happy with this, but if you're a true open access journal, allow authors to retain copyright and apply a license, and they specify the kind of license here, which has to be a CC BY license, and in exceptional cases, they will allow the non-derivatives one. So Plan S took effect from the 1st of January 2021. So it's live and dangerous now, affecting all of our researchers, and especially early career researchers who nobody has any experience in this area, but they don't have the kind of confidence that other authors might have. So they need help in this area. So maybe you can help them with it. What's new about this is the immediacy. The open access has to happen immediately. That's great for open access journals. There has to be specific standards for journals, especially as regards to licenses, and the authors have to retain their copyright in the author's accepted manuscript. And this applies to all journals. It doesn't matter whether they're the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine or the Harvard Law Quarterly, the Harvard Law Review. Wherever these people who are funded by these organizations, these funders, choose to publish, must be compliant, or else there will be sanctions. The future drawdown of their research funding will be stopped, and we've already seen that happen. So we don't want that to happen. The challenges are to make sure that all of our researchers are informed about this and they're equipped for compliance as quickly as possible. We need to get a clear and unambiguous message out. So we might need to include some information on Plan S in our instructions for authors, saying we are Plan S compliant, for example, because X, Y, and Z, giving them comfort and knowing that they're safe with you. I've just given you an example of the copyright addendum that's added in there that the authors have to put in. This work was funded by, let's say, SFI, grant number 12345. For the purpose of open access, the author has applied a CC BY license to any author accepted manuscript version arising from the submission. So in Trinity, we've done a whole lot of things to try and support our researchers to, including this kind of copyright guidance and support and briefing the college committees. And we'll be going around all the schools helping people to get the message out. But I could do with some advice from you guys actually, you know, about what more we can do to help people. And, you know, you'll be very much in tune, especially with early career researchers, with students who want to publish. And if you can capture the concerns and any ways that we can support them together, please let us know, let myself and Shane know. So some of you might have seen some new kids on the block, like the HRB Open Research that's been around for about 2 years. It's a publishing platform, and it's really worthwhile going in and having a look at it. It's an open research publishing platform funded by a funder, the Health Research Board in Ireland, and it applies open peer review. It's open from the very first, after a very, I'm not going to say cursory, a vigilant checking system takes place, but it's very fast. Before peer review, the journal article actually goes up, and the peer review takes place in a live environment. You can see the peer review taking place. It's really worth having a look at this because it's quite different. Of course, it's got its own kind of list using the licensing that we're talking about here. You can see its policies here if you go in under About, and you'll see, and it's really worth looking at this when you're looking at your own policies. Whatever, there's all the ethical policies and so on about image manipulation and so on, data, and there's the license information in there. So I'm going to tell you that, well, you go in and have a look at what for yourself, or what kind of license that they apply in there. You can probably guess by now, but, and here's another one that you might have heard of, Open Research Europe. It's the latest kid on the block, and that is the European Commission's funded open research platform. It's a publishing platform for European research. Again, open peer review, continuous publication, and you'll find the information on the policies under the About page there, now accepting submissions, and it's going to be launched next month in March 2021. So you can see the way that the environment is changing, and these licenses, these Creative Commons licenses and methods of getting this work out there is a way of being able to use copyright law in the interests of the publishers, the authors, and the science and the research, the art, or whatever it is, getting the information out there and getting more impact for the work. So check out the policies for that under About. I'm going to just finish up on where to add the copyright and licensing information in OJS. There's 3 places, depending on where you want it to appear. To designate the copyright holder and add the license terms that will appear on the article page, you do that under the settings, distribution and license. And that will mean that the information on the license will automatically be displayed on each article page. And if your journal distributes articles under different licenses, you can override that information per article in the permissions and disclosure section. To add the copyright notice for authors to accept during the submission and display, and you know how important that is now, because that's going to save you a whole lot of work of going back to them looking for this information. The better the information you include in this section, the less trouble you're going to have. So the more clear it will be for them, and the greater the chance that they will be compliant with it. So if you add in the statement in the settings under workflow, submission, the author guidelines and the copyright notice, then the statement will appear on the author guidelines page. And I know some of you will have done this already. And then finally, you can add the copyright and licensing information on the article galley. So anybody who might read or save it or share it will still know how it can be used. So that's actually embedded in the PDF itself, right? It'll appear on that information. So those are your 3 areas, and you can go in and have a look on at the link for more information on that. Okay. I mentioned the directory of open access journals and articles. So they have a copyright section. This is important. Shane will tell you how important it is. to aim for eventual inclusion in the directory of open access journals. It's a sign of quality and not being one of these, flaky or perhaps illegal predatory journals that are out there. So they insist that the copyright terms to the published content must be clearly stated and separate from the copyright terms applied to the website. The copyright terms should not contradict the licensing terms. You remember I said that? You see that all over the place, even on library sites, copyright the board and governors of Trinity College Dublin, and then you see a Creative Commons license, applied to images and so on. That doesn't make any sense at all. It means their work isn't usable. And all rights reserved is never appropriate for open access content, just letting you know that. So here's the DOAJ is a kind of an overall quality award as a seal. You don't have to go for that. That's kind of like the ultimate, that are, really well established journals are going for, but it's no harm to be aware of what they're looking for, because this is the ultimate. They want the license type and a particular type of Creative Commons license, which we all know about now. They want license information to be displayed in the articles themselves. And they want authors to retain unrestricted copyright and all publishing rights, plus the self-archiving policy. Do you remember I mentioned Sherpa Romeo, that the authors must be permitted to deposit all versions of their papers in an institutional or subject repository and not apply an embargo. So in tune with that. So that gives you an idea of what you could be aiming for if you're aiming for open access, true open access and recognition as that. Of course, that's up to your own policies. And that's where it comes us back to where I started. Inform yourself as you're doing here, decide your policies. You don't have to be open access, but we do encourage you to do that under SOAPbox, obviously, but do make your policies clear in open journal systems for those submissions. And those are the policies that we looked at today. Okay.